Hi, it's Nick Marshall with Lab Guides here. Today we're going to build a Windows Active Directory server. If you're following along in the series, this is the server we're going to build right here, a Windows 2012 R2 AD box. So why would you actually want an Active Directory server? Well, you might want an identity source, you definitely want name resolution and time sync. You might be studying for your MCP or MCSE, or maybe a VMware certification, and it's fairly ubiquitous within corporate IT these days. So what we're actually going to be going through, we'll install Windows, we'll set an admin password and install VMware tools, we'll set a static IP, name server and host name, we'll disable that local firewall for now and enable remote access, then we'll add the AD and DNS services before finally setting a domain name and a restore mode password. There are a couple of resources available here, my AD install script if you'd like it as well. So let's get to it. First we're going to install Windows 2012 R2. So let's start off by building a VM. We'll name it DC-Site A. We'll build another one to do Site B later. We'll choose the storage that we're going to deploy it on, an SSD in this case. We'll choose the Windows 2012 as the VM version, and we're going to change the adapter type to VMXNet 3. Now this won't be available by default with the Windows drivers, but once we install VMware tools, that driver will work. So we'll leave the default 40 gig disk size, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to just modify the amount of cores. We'll give it 2 in this case, and then we'll load the ISO into this VM so that we can boot the installer, and then we'll install Windows. So we'll just load the ISO file which I've previously uploaded to the data store. We'll go in here, we'll make sure it connects that device at power on. We'll open the console and then we'll finally power it on. Now as this machine's booting up, what you'll probably find is that depending on the storage that you've got behind your lab, this could be really quick or it could take a little while. So what I've done in this video is I've sped up any of the slow pieces just to make sure that we're not sitting around waiting. So we'll accept the default language and keyboard formats here. Depending on what you're running, you might want to change things depending on where in the world you are at the moment. And we're going to leave most of the defaults here just because this is a lab and we don't really need to spend the time configuring it. If you're in a corporate environment, that might change. We want a GUI in this case. We don't want core server without the UI. So we'll choose that. We'll accept the license agreement. And then we're going to say custom. We're not doing an upgrade. And we'll just use all of that disk. I'm not going to partition it at all. We'll just fly through this as per default. So what we'll do now is we'll just speed this up and we'll come back once the files are installed. Right, so this server's rebooting now after the install's complete. So what we're going to do now is we're going to log in for the first time and set an administrator password. Keep in mind this is the same password that will be used as the administrator password for the domain that we create later. So this is obviously can be changed, but they will be the same. So let's log in for the first time. We'll just jump out by pressing Ctrl and Alt. Because VMware Tools isn't installed, so we can't just move the mouse, we need to press Ctrl and Alt. We'll log in with that password, and now what we'll do, the first thing that we'll do is we'll install VMware Tools to ensure that we can get that network adapter and all the other relevant drivers that we need for this server to be operational. So we'll just wait for this login to complete. We will close that. And we will open up the VMware Tools installer, which loads itself as an ISO within this VM. So we'll now just run through that installer quickly. And what you'll notice is that as we go through this installer, you can see down the bottom right where the network adapter is, it's currently disconnected. But as we go through this installer, it will load the driver for the network card for the VMXNet 3 driver, which it's doing right now. And then all of a sudden it's joined to the network. So you'll find that there are other drivers that it's installing as well at the same time, but now you'll be able to set an IP and your name servers and the other things that we'll do in a second, and we'll be able to utilize that network connectivity. The E1000 driver that comes by default would have worked, but in this case the VMXNet3 is a more efficient driver, so we're going to use that. This is a home lab, it doesn't have infinite resources, so I try and be as efficient as possible when I build my servers. So let's just log back in here now that the VMware tools has been installed. We'll go in and we'll set a static IP, because this is a domain controller. We don't want it being left up to DHCP as to what IP address it sets. So let's just go into the Ethernet 0 adapter and we will set that IP address for the TCP/IP v4. We're not doing IPv6 at this stage. So we'll just set that IP address to, you'll be able to see those details on the blog article. It's 192, if I don't typo too much, 192.168.20.20 for this VM. Make sure it's relevant to your network if you're not following along step by step this exact guide. We'll also set a name server to be this local host, 127.0.0.1. So what that means is when we install the DNS services in a couple of steps time, it's going to look to the service on the local machine for that step. So as you can see, there's a gateway here. We haven't installed that yet, so I'm just kind of fudging it at the moment. We'll install that piece later, but at this stage we can continue. So let's go in and set the host name of this server on this local machine, because currently it's just the default Windows generated number. So we'll set that as per our VM name, which is just dc-site-a. We'll leave it at workgroup for now because we're going to install a domain controller services on this machine, and we'll restart in a second. What we also want to do is we want to disable that local firewall. Now, you don't necessarily want to do this in your corporate environment, depends on what your security policies are, but in a lab, I find that just for ease of use, unless you've got a specific reason not to, I would disable the local firewall just to avoid any pesky problems. We're not going for a highly secure setup here, so disabling the local firewall in the domain and private and public profiles within this VM is perfectly safe. This is all segregated off from the real world, so it's not a problem. So we've set that, and now we'll reboot this server. And once we've rebooted, we'll be able to install those Microsoft Active Directory services. Okay, so we've rebooted now. We're going to log in, but before we install those AD DNS services, we just want to enable remote access. So enabling remote access means that we don't need to use the console, which we're using now, to be able to access this. We can use what's called remote desktop, used to be called terminal services, and it allows us to use the remote desktop utility, remote desktop connection, to just log into this remotely without needing console access, as I said. So we'll join that now, and we'll add those Active Directory and DNS services finally. So the old way to do it was to run DC promo. I forgot that I was on Windows 2012 instead of Windows 2008, so the way to do it in Windows 2012 is to add the role. So we'll go into the role-based installation feature, and what we'll do is we'll select that we want it to be a domain controller and add all of the prerequisites and dependencies, and we'll also add DNS server as well. Now those features are selected, we can't unselect file services, which annoys me, but I digress. So we'll install those services now, and any of the dependencies we'll just go through and leave everything as default, and we'll restart automatically after it's complete. And we'll run through these steps right now. Right, that's complete now, so we can close that. Now what we want to do is we want to actually go, the services aren't started yet because what we need to do is the post-deployment configuration. So we'll go through, and now what we'll do is we'll set our domain name of a new forest. It's a brand new domain. So we're just going to call this labguides.local. We'll type that in there. And then we will let the deployment continue and reconfigure this server and promote it to an actual domain controller. We'll set the restore mode password, which I'm just setting for the sake of this, the same as my administrator password. We'll keep it simple. As I said before, this is not a highly secure environment, so we'll keep things simple in case there are problems. And we'll leave the DNS settings the same. So once this is complete, the only thing left to do is to reboot this server, and then we'll be able to log in and we will be able to start setting up DNS settings. We'll be able to start setting up users and groups. We'll be able to set this server as the NTP server, because by default when you install Active Directory it becomes a local time sync source as well. So we can just simply let this run through, and then we can reboot and we're pretty much done. I'm just exporting the script here for use of anybody else that wants the exact same settings that I'm using. They'll be available on the blog article and the resource link in the slides that I showed at the beginning, and I'll show it again once we get to the end. So we'll just save that file out, and that will help me rebuild this environment in the future, should I need to make it exactly the same. So the prerequisites are all done. Now it's time to actually install. It's going to sign us out and reboot that. As you can see, it kicked us off the remote console. So I can have a look at the actual console of the server as it's rebooting, which you can't do through remote desktop. But once it's booted up, then we can either use the console or we can use remote desktop to jump back on that server and finalize the configuration. So let's log in now. As you can see, the Lab Guides is the domain name there. We can log in with that previously used administrator password. So if you've got any questions, have a look there and let us know.